In a small Oregon forest, two farmers notice something strange drifting down through the gray morning sky, a massive white balloon shimmering like silk. At first, they think it's a weather instrument. Minutes later, the ground erupts. The explosion rattles the quiet valley. No one understands what they've just witnessed. Word spreads quickly. Reports trickle in from Alaska, California, Wyoming. Fragments of paper and silk, mysterious metal parts. The newspapers call it strange debris, but the military knows better. Something is being launched across the Pacific. Then, on May 5, 1945, tragedy strikes. A pastor's wife and 5 children on a Sunday picnic stumble upon one of these fallen balloons. As they approach, it detonates. They become the only U.S. mainland casualties of enemy action in World War II. Who sent them? How could they have traveled thousands of miles? And what kind of weapon floats silently on the wind? Somewhere, thousands of miles away, a team of engineers in Tokyo was already watching the jet stream and smiling. By late 1944, Japan was losing the war. Its navy was shattered, its cities smoldering under relentless American firebombing. Every day, the front lines crept closer to home. And yet, the Japanese high command refused to surrender. They wanted to strike back to remind the enemy that even across thousands of miles of ocean, Japan could still reach out and touch the American mainland. But how? The Empire's long-range bombers were gone. Submarines couldn't cross the Pacific undetected. Even kamikaze attacks could only hit targets in the Pacific theater. Then, in a quiet meteorological laboratory in Tokyo, scientists stumbled upon something no one else had noticed. A river of wind, invisible but powerful, flowing high above the clouds. They called it the Fujian current, the God wind. Today, we know it as the jet stream, a fast-moving air current capable of carrying an object from Japan to North America in just 3 days. To most, it was a scientific curiosity. To Japan's military scientists, it was an opportunity. If the wind could carry a leaf, perhaps it could carry something else, something far more dangerous. In the autumn of 1944, deep in the forests of Honshu, a top-secret project began. It was codenamed Fugo, short for Fusen Bakudan, or balloon bomb. The concept was breathtakingly simple and terrifyingly clever. Build enormous hydrogen-filled balloons, each 10 meters wide, made from paper and silk, coated in special glue to make them airtight. Attach incendiary and high-explosive bombs. Let the wind do the rest. Each balloon would rise to 30,000 feet, ride the jet stream eastward, and if all went as planned, descend somewhere over North America, dropping its deadly payload on forests, towns, or farms. But there was nothing industrial about these weapons. They weren't built in factories. They were crafted by hand, mostly by young women, students, and laborers. In classrooms converted into workshops, they worked silently, gluing together hundreds of sheets of handmade paper, their breath fogging in the cold. Many of them had no idea what they were building. They were told it was for the war effort, and that their work might turn the tide. Each balloon, when complete, was a delicate work of art, light as air, but capable of carrying death across an ocean. When inflated, it was as wide as a small house. When folded, it could be carried by 2 men. When released, it was at the mercy of the wind. But there was a problem. The journey from Japan to America wasn't easy. The air grew cold at high altitude. Hydrogen contracts when it cools and the balloons would lose lift. If they sank too low, they'd fall into the ocean. So Japan's engineers invented an ingenious device, an automatic ballast system. Each balloon carried a ring of sandbags attached to a barometer. When the balloon descended too far, a fuse would trigger, dropping 1 sandbag, making it lighter. It would rise again until the next drop. The process would repeat dozens of times over 3 days until the final ballast was gone and only the bombs remained. Then, as the balloon descended over the American continent, another fuse would ignite, releasing the bombs. Afterward, the balloon would destroy itself, leaving little evidence behind. It was a weapon guided by physics, patience, and faith in the wind. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched over 9,000 of these balloons. They lifted into the icy skies from the east coast of Honshu, carried by the invisible river of air, the jet stream. The Japanese called them kamikaze of the wind. Not pilots, but paper ghosts. Silent, untouchable, and terrifyingly unpredictable. No one knew exactly where they would land. Some would fall into the ocean. Some might drift north into Canada. And some, just some, would make it all the way to the United States. The plan was audacious. Start massive forest fires in the Pacific Northwest, spread panic, and divert American resources away from the front lines. It was the first intercontinental weapon system in human history, decades before intercontinental missiles would even exist. Imagine standing on a hill in Japan in December 1944, watching a massive white balloon rise slowly into the sky, glowing faintly in the dawn light. No engine, no crew, just silence. And knowing that somewhere, thousands of miles away, its shadow might fall on another continent. In a war filled with tanks, bombers, and battleships, this was something different. A weapon made not of steel and fire, but of air and imagination. It was war, reimagined as art. And it would soon drift over the Pacific, toward a world completely unaware of what was coming. But the engineers had overlooked one thing. The same wind that carried their weapon to America could also turn against them. High above the Japanese coast, winter winds screamed through the jet stream, a river of air the world had only just begun to understand. Down below, in secret testing grounds, teams of engineers and soldiers worked tirelessly. They were building something unlike any weapon ever used in war. It didn't roar, it didn't shoot, it floated, and it worked with one simple ally, the wind. The scientists behind this project were not soldiers. They were meteorologists, university researchers, and young engineers. Many had studied abroad before the war in America, Britain, Germany, before being called home to serve the empire. One of them, a quiet man named Major Teiji Takada, would later describe the Fugo balloon bomb as a marriage between science and faith. He wasn't exaggerating. Each balloon was a marvel of low-tech innovation, 10 meters in diameter, made of hundreds of sheets of washi paper, glued together with a special paste made from konnyaku root, the same starch used in Japanese noodles. When dried, it became strong, flexible, and waterproof, able to withstand freezing temperatures and the long voyage across the Pacific. But paper and glue were only part of the secret. The genius lay in the automatic altitude control system, an invention so advanced, Allied scientists were stunned when they finally saw it. The balloon carried a barometer that sensed air pressure. As the balloon cooled at night and began to sink, a fuse would trigger a small explosive charge. One of the sandbags would drop away, making the balloon lighter. It would rise again until the next descent. Each balloon carried 30 sandbags. That meant it could automatically regulate its altitude 30 times, keeping it afloat for more than 70 hours, just enough time to cross the Pacific. When the sandbags were gone, a final switch triggered the bomb load. The main explosive, a 15-kilogram fragmentation bomb, was released, followed by small incendiaries meant to ignite forest fires. Once empty, the balloon's own hydrogen gas was vented, and it self-destructed. The engineers had built a self-operating intercontinental bomber out of paper, twine, and ingenuity. Launching them was an operation of eerie beauty. Crews of soldiers and students worked by torchlight, inflating the balloons with hydrogen produced on-site from chemical generators. When the gas filled the envelope, the great white sphere shimmered in the dark, ghostly against the stars. They were launched only at dawn, when the winds were most stable. Each release was timed to align with the jet stream, the invisible highway that would carry them east. To witnesses, the sight was unforgettable. Dozens of enormous white balloons rising silently into the winter sky, their bombs dangling beneath like pendulums of death. And then, within minutes, they were gone, lost to the upper atmosphere, drifting toward a world that had no idea they existed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, strange things began to happen. Air Force radar picked up unexplained signals. Pilots on coastal patrol reported mysterious objects floating high above the clouds, silver spheres that shimmered, then vanished. No one could identify them. Weather balloons? Enemy reconnaissance? The sightings were dismissed as imagination or atmospheric flukes. Then, in December 1944, something extraordinary happened. A lumberjack in Wyoming discovered an enormous silk balloon tangled in the trees. Nearby, strange metal fragments littered the snow. He reported it to local authorities, who passed it on to the military. Within hours, scientists at the U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Division were examining the wreckage. They were baffled. The material wasn't American. The instruments were marked in Japanese script. But how could it have gotten here? The Pacific Ocean was 5,000 miles wide. No known aircraft could cross it, and certainly not something made of paper. The discovery raised more questions than answers, and it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few weeks, more debris was found. Fragments in Alaska, shrapnel in Montana, a balloon ring in California. Each piece told the same story. Japan had found a way to send death across the ocean silently. But as the evidence mounted, the U.S. government made a critical decision. If Japan realized the balloons were working, they might launch even more. So the news was suppressed. The Office of Censorship issued strict orders: no newspapers, no radio broadcasts, no leaks. To the public, nothing had happened. Only a handful of people knew that the skies above America had been invaded, not by planes, but by ghosts. Each balloon that reached North America was a triumph of science and desperation. They were built with precision and care, but guided by chance and weather, a symbol of how far a nation would go to be heard, even when its voice was fading. But as the balloons kept coming, something unexpected began to happen. Japan stopped receiving reports. No fires, no explosions, no proof of success. To them, it looked like failure, but it wasn't. It was silence, deliberate, strategic silence. Back in Tokyo, as engineers packed up their drawings and soldiers dismantled the launch sites, a message arrived from the front. Cease operations, no results. But they were wrong. Some of their creations had already landed. Others were still drifting, somewhere above the clouds. And one of them soon would change everything. They didn't see it coming. No planes, no engines, no warning, just a whisper in the wind. And then fire. It was December 6th, 1944, when the first reports came in. A farmer outside Kalispell, Montana, found something strange in his field, a torn sheet of paper unlike anything he'd seen before. It was thick, fibrous, layered, almost handmade. Embedded in the soil nearby was a small metal ring, scorched black. He thought it might be debris from a weather balloon. He was wrong. Over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Sightings, discoveries, whispers. A park ranger in Washington found a deflated balloon tangled in pine trees. A pilot near San Pedro saw what looked like a silver sun drifting high above the clouds. No one could explain it, and then the Army stepped in. They called it Operation Firefly. Teams from the U.S., Army Air Forces, the FBI, and even the Forest Service were dispatched quietly, instructed to collect debris, seal it, and report it only to Washington. No one was to speak about what they found, because what they were finding wasn't supposed to exist. The lab reports confirmed it. The material was Japanese. The design, precise. The intent, unmistakable. A weapon, a silent one. These weren't just random balloons drifting across the Pacific. They were guided by the jet stream, a natural highway 30,000 feet above the Earth, a phenomenon barely understood at the time. Japan had found it, and they were using it. Within weeks, the pattern became clear. Each recovered balloon had launched from the same region in Japan. Each had traveled over 5,000 miles, and some were carrying live explosives still armed. The press was ordered to remain silent. The military feared panic, and worse, that if Japan learned the bombs were reaching America, they would send thousands more. So the story disappeared. To the public, there was no invasion, no strange wreckage, no danger floating above their heads. Only a handful of officials knew that a foreign weapon had already landed on U.S. soil, and that more were coming every single day. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was May 5th, 1945, near the small logging town of WWII, Oregon. A Sunday school teacher named Elsie Mitchell had driven into the mountains with her husband and 5 children from her church group. They were looking for a good picnic spot. They parked by the trees. The children ran ahead, laughing, chasing each other through the clearing. Then one of them saw something, a strange, silvery balloon half buried in the ground. Wires trailed from it like vines. "Look what I found!" one of the boys shouted. Elsie turned. Her husband, Archie, was unloading lunch from the car. She started toward the children, and in that moment, the forest exploded. The blast echoed for miles. When rescuers arrived, they found a crater nearly 4 feet deep. Elsie and all 5 children were gone, the only American civilians killed by enemy action in the continental United States during World War II. The cause was a Japanese balloon bomb, one that had drifted across the Pacific for more than 6,000 miles before falling silent among the Oregon pines. News of the tragedy was nearly suppressed again. But this time, the story leaked. A small-town paper ran a headline that would soon echo across the country. 6 killed by mysterious Japanese balloon. Suddenly, America realized something chilling. The war had reached their own backyard, across the Pacific. Japan never knew. They thought their balloon project had failed. The government had ordered it shut down months earlier. They never heard about WWII, Oregon. They never knew that their ghost weapons had claimed real lives. And yet, something strange began happening soon after. Reports started coming in from the U.S. military. Balloons still falling. Explosives still found in remote fields, in forests, in frozen lakes. Some still armed, some intact. And then, one night, deep in the mountains of British Columbia, a radar station went dark. No one knew why, until soldiers arrived. What they found wasn't wreckage. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't have still been moving. The war in the Pacific was ending. But the balloons, they were still coming. The war was almost over. Japan was burning. The Allies were closing in. But across the Pacific, the ghosts were still drifting. Silent, weightless, waiting. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese balloon campaign was supposed to be history. Tokyo had already moved its focus to defending the homeland. American bombers were pounding cities day and night. No one in Japan thought their strange wind-borne weapons were still reaching U.S. soil. They were wrong. Reports continued to trickle in. A rancher in Wyoming finding strange parachute cords tangled in his fence. A fisherman in Alaska spotting a sphere of rubber caught in sea ice. A Canadian radar post briefly detecting an unidentified object right before it went dark. The war had shifted to oceans and cities, but the sky, it seemed, hadn't let go of its secrets. Even in August 1945, the same month as Hiroshima, military recovery teams were still combing through remote valleys and frozen forests, searching for what they called stragglers. Some were just torn fragments. Others weren't. One afternoon, in the rugged wilderness of British Columbia, a patrol team came across something unexpected. At first, it looked like a massive snow-covered boulder, but as they approached, the surface began to glint faintly silk, not stone. It was a balloon, intact, its gondola still attached, half buried in frost. The men circled it warily. A faint ticking sound came from within, rhythmic, mechanical, alive. They radioed for instructions. Headquarters told them one thing: do not touch it. They marked the site and withdrew. When the bomb disposal unit arrived 2 days later, the balloon was gone. Only the scorched outline in the snow remained. It was as if the sky had reclaimed its creation. Across North America, sightings continued through early 1946. Locals reported strange lights floating at dusk. Others swore they heard distant explosions echoing from the mountains. Most were dismissed as rumors, but the Army knew better. Because every few weeks, another balloon fragment appeared, sometimes with its explosives still intact, sometimes fused to the earth by fire, and sometimes something worse. One recovery team near Boise, Idaho, opened a deflated balloon that had snagged in a pine grove. Inside, they found soil foreign, volcanic, black. When tested, it matched samples from central Japan. That meant the bombs weren't just weapons. They were messages, carried across oceans by wind, proof that Japan's reach was far greater than anyone had believed. After Japan's surrender, most records of the balloon project were destroyed. What little remained told a story, both tragic and brilliant. The balloons, called Fugo, were launched from hidden bases on Japan's eastern coast. Each one was built by hand, from hundreds of sheets of paper glued together by schoolgirls. Some were made from washi, the same paper used for calligraphy and lanterns. Beautiful, fragile, deadly. They had timers, ballast systems, and bombs, all designed to release at precise intervals as the wind carried them eastward. A triumph of ingenuity and futility. Out of more than 9,000 launched, only about 300 ever reached North America. But that was enough to change everything. In the years that followed, the bombs became folklore. Hunters, hikers, and farmers stumbled upon remnants in the wild, sometimes decades later. Each discovery brought the same chilling thought: if one could survive that long, how many more were still out there? The government issued quiet warnings to rural communities. Report any strange debris. Do not disturb. Even today, unexploded Fugo bombs are occasionally found rusted, silent, deadly still. One was discovered in British Columbia in 2014, another in Alaska in 2023, 78 years later. The war still whispers. But there's one mystery that was never solved. A classified report from 1949 mentions an incident, a balloon of unusual design, discovered deep in the Cascade Mountains. Recovered components suggested something different from standard Fugo construction: thicker paper, a larger payload, and what looked like a radio antenna. The file ends abruptly. No follow-up, no explanation. Just 2 words, typed in red ink: project denied. The official record says the last Japanese balloon reached North America in April 1945. But some of those who searched for them, soldiers, scientists, even civilians, told a different story. They said that sometimes, on still nights, radar screens showed slow-moving blips over the Pacific, too high for birds, too slow for planes, drifting, endlessly drifting. And maybe, just maybe, some of the ghosts that Japan sent into the sky never came down at all. They said the balloon bombs were forgotten. They said the story ended when Japan surrendered. They were wrong, because when the war ended, the files didn't. They just went deeper. In the fall of 1945, while the world celebrated peace, another kind of war was already beginning. One fought not with guns or planes, but with secrets. The U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Division began gathering every scrap of information it could find about the Japanese Fugo balloons. To most officers, it was just cleanup work. To a few, it was something else. The documents revealed details that didn't fit the public story. Balloons recovered far inland, well beyond known wind paths, fragments made from materials that didn't match any found in Japan, and strange metal components, labeled only as non-military purpose, unknown. One memo, dated November 1945, was marked Top Secret, Eyes Only. It read, "Recovered device exhibits anomalous radioactivity. Recommend immediate transfer to Los Alamos for analysis." Los Alamos, the birthplace of the atomic bomb. Why send a paper balloon there? By 1946, the investigation had moved underground, literally. A small group of engineers and physicists began testing what they called foreign atmospheric vehicles. Their goal: to determine if these balloons had been carrying more than explosives. One surviving engineer, interviewed decades later, hinted at what they found. Some of those instruments weren't designed to kill, they were designed to measure. Measure what? Exactly. He never said. But the timing was suspicious. America had just entered the age of nuclear weapons, and the U.S. government was suddenly very interested in high-altitude air currents, the same currents that had carried Japan's balloons across the Pacific. Inside a facility near Alamogordo, New Mexico, scientists tested recovered balloon fragments. They found traces of compounds used in atmospheric sampling and an early prototype of what looked like a radiation detection plate. Could Japan have been trying to gather data on nuclear fallout? Or was someone else using their technology to do it now? Because by 1947, the same scientists who studied the Fugo balloons began working on another project, one that involved high-altitude balloons, remote sensors, and classified payloads. Its name? Project Mogul. Officially, it was about listening for Soviet nuclear tests. Unofficially, it would become one of the most mysterious government projects in modern history, the same one later tied to the Roswell incident. But hidden in those early Mogul documents was something chilling, a note referencing Japanese-derived design models, atmospheric behavior consistent with 1945 tests. 1945 tests. The year the Fugo balloons were still drifting over America. That meant the government hadn't just studied Japan's technology, they had repurposed it. One engineer wrote in the margins, "Original mechanisms far more complex than expected. Unknown purpose of onboard coil." A coil, not a bomb fuse, not a ballast timer. Something else. Something they didn't understand. In 1952, 7 years after the war, an internal Air Force memo surfaced briefly before disappearing again. It mentioned a balloon recovery operation, Northern Cascades region, and a secondary payload device of interest to atomic research. The final line read, "Recovered material transferred to Wright Field. Classification upgraded to Q clearance." Q clearance. That's nuclear access, the same level used in atomic energy projects. So now, the story of the Fugo wasn't just about Japan. It was about what the United States found and what it might have used to advance its own secret programs. In the decades that followed, the files were quietly sealed. Some were reclassified, others were shredded, but a few, just a few, survived. In 1991, a researcher at the National Archives uncovered a battered folder labeled Japan, Atmospheric Balloons, MISC, Data. Inside were fragments of maps, Japanese weather charts, and 3 American reports marked Restricted, 1949. One contained a single photograph, a large, circular object lying in the snow, half buried, half burned. Scrawled beneath it in pencil were 3 words, "Not of ours." No date, no coordinates, nothing else. The folder was confiscated the next day, but one final document remained. A transmission log, partially declassified in 2010. It detailed a brief radio exchange from December 1949 between 2 Air Force posts in Washington state. The message read, "Unidentified aerial object drifting northeast. Estimated altitude 35,000 feet. Shape consistent with known Fugo type, but metallic composition detected. Tracking lost at 0400 hours." And then, nothing. No follow-up. No recovery. Just silence. Some say it was just a leftover balloon carried by the wind long after the war. Others believe it was something else, something born from the war's most secret experiments, still floating somewhere above us. Because sometimes, the sky doesn't forget. They said the war ended in August of 1945, but somewhere, far from the cities and surrender ceremonies, there were men still moving, following orders that no longer existed. In the weeks after Japan's surrender, hundreds of convoys crossed the Pacific, carrying supplies, scientists, and documentation for post-war assessments. Most were routine. One was not. It departed from Yokosuka under a false manifest, listed as carrying meteorological instruments and technical reports. Its destination, an American naval base in the Mariana Islands. Its real cargo, no one ever confirmed. The convoy consisted of 3 small Japanese transport ships, escorted by a single U.S. destroyer. Witnesses said they sailed quietly, with minimal lights and no radio chatter. The voyage should have taken less than 5 days, but only 2 ships arrived. The third, the Tenyomaru, vanished somewhere between Iwo Jima and Guam. At first, the Americans assumed it had struck a mine or hit rough weather, but then fragments began to appear. Planks, crates, and bits of machinery washed up on remote islands, all marked with the same insignia, a crimson circle within a white square. That symbol didn't belong to any known Japanese military division. In fact, it didn't belong to any record at all. Among the wreckage, a single crate survived intact. It was recovered by Navy divers weeks later and transported under armed guard. The inventory record still exists, filed under Recovered Foreign Material #271-B. Its description is short, 5 words. Metallic sphere, 3 feet diameter. No further details were listed. No photographs. No measurements. No origin. The file ends with a transfer order. Send to Fort Detrick, Maryland. Priority 1. That's where things get stranger. Fort Detrick wasn't a naval base. It was home to the U.S. Army's Biological Research Division, the same facility studying the effects of disease, toxins, and environmental exposure. So why would a metallic sphere from a sunken Japanese ship be sent there? Theories started within the intelligence community almost immediately. Some claimed the Tenyomaru had been carrying remnants of Japan's secret Unit 731 experiments, evidence that Washington wanted buried. Others believed the sphere was connected to Japan's balloon bomb program, perhaps an advanced prototype or atmospheric sensor. But there was one detail most people overlooked. The Fugo balloons and the Tenyomaru convoy were both overseen by the same division of Japan's Imperial Army, the 9th Technical Research Bureau. That bureau specialized in unconventional weapons and, more disturbingly, in joint research with German scientists before the war's end. When Germany collapsed, many of its scientists vanished. Some were captured by the Allies. Others were not. By late 1946, The U.S. had already begun quietly recruiting Japanese and German scientists through Operation Paperclip. Officially, it was for aerospace and engineering development. Unofficially, it was also about containment, ensuring dangerous knowledge didn't fall into Soviet hands. Among those secretly transported to American soil was a meteorologist named Dr. Kiyoshi Nakata, one of the designers of the Fugo balloons. His assignment? Project Mogul, the same project born from the recovery of Japanese balloon technology. The same project that used high-altitude sensors to detect nuclear activity. And according to a recently declassified memo, Nakata wasn't the only one from that convoy who made it to America. 2 others, unnamed, unlisted, unacknowledged, were relocated to a facility in New Mexico in early 1946. Their area of expertise: materials of non-terrestrial durability. That phrase appears nowhere else in any military archive. It doesn't refer to metals, polymers, or alloys, at least not any known at the time. When the reporter who found that document requested access to the original file, it was gone. The folder had been reclassified. Its contents transferred to a new department. Atomic Energy Commission. Restricted data. And then, silence. For decades, the Tenyo Maru was a forgotten footnote, a name on a lost convoy list. But recently, divers exploring wrecks near the Bonin Islands found something remarkable. Half buried in silt, beneath 300 feet of water, they discovered a hull fragment part of a ship's bow. Welded into the metal were faint markings in English, not Japanese. The words read, "Property of U.S. Army Signal Corps." The divers filmed the find. The footage was sent to a maritime historian in Hawaii, but before the video could be publicly released, it disappeared from the university archives. The historian who logged it passed away 6 months later. His assistant said he'd been working on a paper titled "The Transfer That Never Happened." Only 1 page was ever recovered. It contained a single paragraph, a line from a post-war naval communication. The convoy's purpose was to exchange research materials under controlled supervision. Only 1 delivery completed. The rest, lost at sea. Lost at sea. That phrase repeats in multiple classified documents, always referring to materials, never people. But one unverified intelligence report from 1947 suggests otherwise. It describes a foreign vessel seen adrift weeks after the Tenyo Maru's disappearance, empty, damaged, with no crew aboard. On its deck, investigators claimed to find something extraordinary: a half-deflated paper balloon and the charred remains of an American radio beacon. If that report is true, it means the Japanese weren't the only ones experimenting with transoceanic flight at the end of the war. It means someone, perhaps on both sides, was still launching things long after the fighting stopped. And that brings us to the final mystery. A small entry in a naval logbook dated January 1946 reads, "Recovered signal from unidentified source. Pattern matches pre-war Japanese code, but transmission originates from above Pacific airspace. Duration: 3 minutes, 42 seconds. Then silence. No explanation. No follow-up. Just that one haunting note. A message from nowhere. Maybe the war was over, but the ghosts were still talking." It began as a whisper in static. A brief transmission, 3 minutes and 42 seconds, captured on a naval receiver somewhere between Hawaii and the Aleutians. The signal was faint, but unmistakable. A sequence of tones and pauses arranged in an old Japanese meteorological code. Only one problem: the war was over. Japan had surrendered 5 months earlier, and the source of that transmission was moving. U.S. naval intelligence tried to triangulate its origin. The signal wasn't coming from a ship or a base. It wasn't bouncing off the ionosphere like long-range broadcasts usually did. It was coming from the upper atmosphere, tens of thousands of feet above the Pacific Ocean. At first, they thought it was a malfunction, some leftover equipment reactivating after a storm. But when the code was translated, it became something else entirely. It wasn't weather data. It was a status report. Deployment successful. Awaiting confirmation. Altitude stable. No one could explain it. The report matched the old Japanese Fugo balloon format exactly, except for one small difference. It used a new serial code, one that didn't appear in any wartime registry. The military filed it under unverified signal. But a few weeks later, another message came. Same structure, same altitude, different coordinates. This time it ended with a chilling line. Return signal weak. Transmission complete. The coordinates pointed to a patch of ocean nearly 1,200 miles west of California. It was the same region where, in 1945, an American weather balloon had gone missing during a classified operation called Project Mogul. Mogul, officially, was designed to track Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude microphones. Unofficially, it was built on Japanese Fugo technology, the same paper balloons once used to carry bombs across the Pacific. But this transmission suggested something impossible, that one of those hybrid devices was still in flight. A joint intelligence task force was quietly formed to investigate. Their search led them to Dr. Kiyoshi Nakata, the same Japanese scientist who had been brought to America under Operation Paperclip. When they showed him the transmission logs, he went pale. Then, without explanation, he asked for a glass of water and a map of the Pacific. He traced a slow line between Iwo Jima and the coast of Oregon, marking a point near the center. Then he said something the translator later described as half confession, half warning. If it still moves, then it was never meant to land. According to Nakata's old research, late in the war, the Japanese had experimented with a new type of Fugo balloon, one designed not to deliver bombs, but to collect data. It carried an instrument they called Tenrai, or Heaven's Thunder. It was built to measure radiation levels in the upper atmosphere, something Japan had become obsessed with after hearing rumors of America's atomic project. Only 5 of these experimental balloons were ever constructed. 4 were destroyed before launch. The 5th vanished. Now, 20 years later, its signal had returned. The Americans deployed surveillance aircraft to sweep the area. For 3 days, they found nothing. Then, on the morning of January 17th, radar picked up a faint object at extreme altitude. Unidentified. Metallic. Moving slowly eastward. It appeared to be powered, not drifting. The pilots who made visual contact described it as a silver disk, partially inflated, reflecting sunlight like a mirror. One even said it looked almost self-correcting, adjusting its altitude in response to air pressure. The object was tracked until nightfall. Then it disappeared. The official report was buried, classified under Aeronautical Research Anomaly. End quote. But a separate note, found decades later in declassified Air Force archives, added something that never made it to the final file. Recovered fragments south of Roswell, July 1947, consistent with high-altitude balloon material, possible connection to Project Mogul experimental flight path. The date, the material, the secrecy. Everything matched. Historians now believe the transmission intercepted in 1946, the message in the sky was the final ping from that lost Fugo prototype. After Timinchins of Weidingaum, a balloon born from wartime deception that outlived the war itself. And maybe, just maybe, it sparked one of the most famous mysteries in American history. When asked about it years later, one of the engineers from Project Mogul gave a cryptic response. "We weren't the first to send something into the stratosphere. We were just the first to pretend we didn't know what it was." Even now, no physical trace of the Tenrai device has ever been recovered. But somewhere in the depths of the National Archives, there's a file stamped "Reopened, 1962." Inside are only 2 pages. One is the original transmission report from January 1946. The other is a typewritten note, unsigned, undated. It reads, "Heaven's thunder has not fallen. It watches still." And that's how the story of the Japanese balloon bombs truly ends. Not with an explosion, but with an echo. A whisper in the upper atmosphere that refused to die. Maybe it's still there, floating in silence. A relic of a war that learned to lie. Or maybe it came down long ago, buried in some forgotten forest or field. Its message finally gone quiet. But one thing is certain. Long before satellites, long before spy planes, long before the space age began, someone had already reached for the sky, and their ghost never came back down.